Right now, as you watch this, somewhere in the world, a massive ship is moving through a narrow strip of water between Malaysia and Indonesia. On that ship, your phone, your laptop, your clothes, the microchips inside your car, maybe even the ingredients in your food. This strip of water is called the Strait of Malacca, and it is, without exaggeration, the most important waterway on Earth. More than 90,000 ships pass through it every single year. That's roughly 250 ships per day, one every 6 minutes. The strait is only 2.8 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, that's less than 2 miles, a patch of water so small you could almost throw a stone across it. Yet it carries over 40% of global trade. If you shut it down tomorrow, the global economy would collapse within weeks. And China knows this. More than any country on earth, China knows this. Because right now, China depends on this strait more than anyone else, and that terrifies them. So today we are going to answer 3 questions. Why does Malaysia control this choke point? Why does China call it its greatest vulnerability? And what is China doing right now to try to escape it? Before we talk about China's plan, you need to understand just how critical this strait really is. Because it's not just important, it's irreplaceable. Look at the geography. Southeast Asia is basically a giant funnel. Ships coming from the Middle East carrying oil and gas must pass through this funnel to reach Japan, South Korea, China, Taiwan, the industrial heart of the world. Ships coming from Europe carrying manufactured goods use this same funnel on the way back. Ships from Africa, from South Asia, from the Indian Ocean, all roads lead to Malacca. This strait is flanked by 3 countries, Indonesia to the south, Malaysia to the north, and Singapore sitting right at the exit like a security guard at a very important door. Together, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore have legal control over these waters. But in terms of economic and political influence, Malaysia is the one with the most skin in the game. Malaysia's entire west coast runs along the strait. Its biggest ports, Port Klang and Penang, are both right there. Hundreds of thousands of Malaysian jobs depend on those ships passing through safely every single day. Let me give you some numbers to make this concrete. The Strait of Malacca handles 1/3 of the world's traded goods by value, over 60% of global LNG shipments, 80% of China's oil imports, nearly all of Japan's energy needs, a massive chunk of South Korea's and Taiwan's trade. When economists talk about choke points, they mean a place where if something goes wrong, everything goes wrong. The Suez Canal is one, the Panama Canal is another, but Malacca is in a different league. The Suez Canal can be bypassed. You go around Africa, it takes longer, but it works. Panama has an alternative route too, but Malacca, the only serious alternative is the Lombok Strait, which is hundreds of miles longer, adds days to every voyage, and costs shipping companies millions in extra fuel. There is no easy way around Malacca, that's why it's called a choke point. Now let's talk about China. China is the world's largest trading nation. It imports more oil than any other country on earth. Its factories run on energy, and most of that energy comes from the Middle East and Africa. All of it arriving by ship, all of it passing through the Strait of Malacca. In 2003, Chinese President Hu Jintao gave a speech that sent shockwaves through China's military and economic establishment. He used a phrase that has been quoted ever since. He called it the Malacca Dilemma. The dilemma is this: China's entire economic survival depends on a tiny waterway that China does not control. If a war broke out, say between China and the United States over Taiwan, the US Navy could blockade the Strait of Malacca and cut off Chinese oil supply almost overnight. No oil, no factories, no economy, game over. And it's not just war. Even without a military conflict, piracy, terrorism, or a major shipping accident in those narrow waters could trigger a global crisis. Remember, we are talking about a lane barely 2 miles wide in places. One ship sinking in the wrong spot could bottle up hundreds of vessels. Here's what makes this even more uncomfortable for Beijing. China's rival, the United States, has military bases in Singapore, Japan, Guam, and throughout the Pacific. The US Navy is essentially the unofficial police force of the world's oceans. That means China, every single day, is dependent on a waterway that is effectively under American protection. It's like running your business out of your competitor's building and paying them to do it. Beijing calls this strategic encirclement. They feel surrounded, complicated, and in terms of maritime geography, they're not wrong. So what does China do? It comes up with a plan, a very big, very expensive, very controversial plan. In 2013, President Xi Jinping announced what would become the most ambitious infrastructure project in human history. He called it the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. On the surface, it sounds generous. China will lend money to developing countries to build roads, railways, ports, and pipelines. Everybody gets infrastructure, everybody wins, right? Well, not exactly. Because if you look at where these roads and railways are being built, the pattern becomes very clear. Every major Belt and Road project is designed to help China move its goods and energy by land rather than by sea. In other words, to avoid the Strait of Malacca entirely. The crown jewel of this plan is called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC. It's a $62 billion network of roads, railways, and pipelines that runs from the Chinese city of Kashgar through Pakistan all the way to the port of Gwadar on the Arabian Sea. Think about that geographically. China can now move oil and goods from the Arabian Sea, where Middle Eastern oil originates, directly overland into China's western provinces. No ships, no straits, no American Navy. The distance is cut dramatically. Instead of sailing all the way around Southeast Asia and through Malacca, goods travel a direct overland route of about 3,000 kilometers. For China, this is transformational. It's like building a back door when someone is guarding your front door. But CPEC is not the only escape route. China has also built oil and gas pipelines through Myanmar, the country formerly known as Burma, connecting Chinese refineries directly to the Bay of Bengal. Since 2017, oil tankers dock in Myanmar, offload their crude, and it gets pumped directly into China by pipeline. Again, no Strait of Malacca required. Then there is the project that China really wants but hasn't been able to build yet. It's called the Kra Canal, or the Thai Canal, and it's been a geopolitical fantasy for over 400 years. The idea is simple: cut a canal across the narrow southern neck of Thailand. This would create a new shipping lane connecting the Indian Ocean directly to the South China Sea, bypassing the Strait of Malacca completely. The benefits for China would be enormous. Ships would save hundreds of miles, transit times would drop, China would have a route it could potentially influence or even control, completely separate from the Malacca choke point. China has lobbied hard for this canal for decades, but Thailand has always said no. Why? Because it could devastate Singapore's economy. Singapore is one of the world's greatest trading hubs precisely because it sits at the mouth of the Malacca Strait. A Kra Canal would reroute ships away from Singapore and Malaysia's southern ports, potentially overnight. The geopolitics here are complex. ASEAN nations don't want to choose between China and the West, and nobody wants to hand China a shortcut that also hands China more leverage. So where does this leave Malaysia? In a position that sounds great on paper and is genuinely terrifying to manage in practice. Malaysia sits at the center of the world's most critical trade artery. Its ports are among the busiest on earth. Port Klang alone handles over 13 million container units per year. Penang Port is a global electronics hub, home to factories for Intel, Bosch, and dozens of other multinationals. Malaysia is also the world's third largest producer of microchips. Thanks partly to its location and partly to decades of smart industrialization, it has become a critical node in the global supply chain. When companies talk about moving supply chains out of China, which they have been doing rapidly since COVID, Malaysia is one of the top destinations. American, European, and Japanese companies are setting up factories there. Malaysia's electronics exports have surged to over $100 billion a year. But here's the tightrope Malaysia has to walk. On one side, China is Malaysia's biggest trading partner. Chinese tourists fill Malaysian hotels. Chinese companies invest in Malaysian infrastructure. Malaysia has participated in Belt and Road projects. The relationship is deep, complex, and economically vital. On the other side, the United States and the West. America wants Malaysia to restrict Chinese tech companies, limit Chinese military access, and align with Western values on issues like human rights and the South China Sea. And in the South China Sea, which borders borders Malaysia to the east, China has been aggressively claiming territory that Malaysia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and others say belongs to them. Chinese ships have repeatedly entered what Malaysia considers its exclusive economic zone, sometimes confronting Malaysian fishing and coast guard vessels. Malaysia has responded carefully. It protests but quietly. It builds relationships with the US military but doesn't host American bases. It trades with China but is slowly diversifying. It's a masterclass in strategic ambiguity, and it's not always comfortable. China has also invested billions in Malaysian infrastructure. The most notable example is the East Coast Rail Link, a 688-kilometer railway cutting across peninsular Malaysia, connecting the east and west coasts, cost $16 billion, mostly financed by Chinese loans. When the Malaysian government changed in 2018, the new Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad immediately flagged the project as too expensive and potentially exploitative. He renegotiated the deal, cut the price significantly, and continued the project on new terms. That moment was significant. Malaysia is not a pushover. It has learned, like many developing nations, that Belt and Road deals require scrutiny and sometimes renegotiation. Zoom out and what you see is a 21st century great game, the same kind of geographic chess match that Britain and Russia played in Asia in the 1800s, just updated for a globalized world. The United States built its post-World War II dominance partly on controlling the world's sea lanes. The US Navy patrols the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, the routes that every barrel of oil, every container of goods must travel. This is not an accident, it's strategy. China wants to break out of that system. Belt and Road is not charity, it's a geographic strategy to create land routes that bypass US naval power. Every pipeline, every railway, every port that China builds is a move on this chessboard. And other countries are taking notice. India, which has its own rivalry with China, has started building infrastructure in the region to counter Chinese influence. The US has its own competing initiative, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, trying to offer developing countries an alternative to Chinese financing. In the middle of all this, Malaysia and the Strait of Malacca, a 550-mile waterway that everyone wants access to and nobody wants to give up control of. So after all these plans, all these billions of dollars, all this geopolitical maneuvering, is China any closer to solving its Malacca Dilemma? Honestly, partially. The Myanmar pipelines are real and operational. They carry a meaningful amount of China's oil, but not nearly enough to replace sea routes. The capacity is limited. The pipelines are also running through a country, Myanmar, that is currently in the middle of a brutal civil war, making them a fragile bet. CPEC is the most strategically significant project, but it's also plagued with problems. Pakistan's economy has been in crisis for years. The security situation in Balochistan, where Gwadar port sits, is unstable. Separatist groups have repeatedly attacked Chinese workers and infrastructure. Progress has been slower than either side hoped. The Canal remains a dream. Thailand hasn't agreed to it, and given the regional politics, it's unlikely to happen anytime soon. And here's the fundamental problem with all land routes. They are more expensive than sea routes. Ships are still the cheapest way to move large quantities of goods. A container on a ship costs a fraction of what the same container costs on a train. China can build all the land infrastructure it wants, but economics will keep companies using sea routes unless the cost gap closes dramatically. Which means for the foreseeable future, China is still dependent on the Strait of Malacca. Its Malacca Dilemma has not been solved. It has been reduced slightly but not solved. The next decade is going to be fascinating and potentially dangerous. Tensions over Taiwan are rising. If a conflict breaks out between China and the United States, the Strait of Malacca becomes an immediate flashpoint. The US might not even need to fire a shot. Just positioning naval assets near the strait could cause global panic. Malaysia's role will become even more critical. As a neutral country with direct influence over the strait, its diplomatic posture matters enormously. A Malaysia that tilts hard toward China or hard toward the US changes the entire equation. Watch for a few things in the coming years. 1. The status of CPEC. If it succeeds, China gains real strategic depth. If it fails, the Malacca Dilemma remains fully unsolved. 2. The Canal question. Every few years, it comes back onto the table, and each time China lobbies harder. 3. Malaysia's relationship with both superpowers. If Malaysia accepts more Chinese infrastructure investment, it may gain leverage, but also risk dependency. If it moves closer to the US, it gains security guarantees but risks economic friction with China. These are not abstract questions for economists. They are questions that will shape what you pay for your goods, how stable global supply chains are, and whether the next decade brings trade or conflict. Here's the thing about geography. It doesn't change. The Strait of Malacca has been critical for over 1,000 years. Since Arab traders first used it in the 7th century, empires have risen and fallen trying to control it. The Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, they all understood that whoever controlled Malacca controlled the trade of the world. Today, it's Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore who hold that legacy, and they face the same pressures every great power before them faced. How do you use your position to stay relevant, stay wealthy, and stay safe when the world's superpowers are fighting over the waters at your doorstep? China will keep building its alternative routes, the US will keep patrolling its sea lanes, and Malaysia will keep walking that tightrope quietly, carefully, profitably. Because in global trade, geography is destiny, and Malaysia's destiny runs right through the most important 550 miles of water on the planet. If you found this useful, hit subscribe. We cover the economics behind the headlines every week, and if you want to understand another piece of the global economy, click here. See you next time.